I never thought I'd be writing this, but after what happened yesterday, I need to get this off my chest. Some of you might think this is fake because honestly, who does this to a kid? But here we are. When I was 11, my dad Douglas remarried this woman Vanessa. She had twin boys, James and Gideon, who were 13 at the time. My mom had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and dad was desperate to give me a mother figure. What a joke that turned out to be. From the moment Vanessa moved into our house, she made it clear I was a problem that needed solving. She started small at first, commenting on how much food I ate compared to her boys, mentioning how my clothes were getting expensive, making little remarks about how James and Gideon needed their own space and maybe I should move to the basement room. My dad was so wrapped up in his new perfect family that he basically checked out of being my parent. He'd nod along to whatever Vanessa said, probably just grateful someone else was willing to deal with the inconvenience of his dead wife's kid. I started eating less at dinner just to avoid the comments. I stopped asking for new clothes even when mine got too small. I tried to be invisible, but it wasn't enough for Vanessa. Nothing I did was ever enough. The breaking point came 6 months after they got married. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and I remember it perfectly because it was the day my life completely changed. Vanessa called a family meeting after dinner. She made me sit at our kitchen table while she pulled out her laptop and started what I can only describe as the most deranged PowerPoint presentation I've ever seen. Yeah, you read that right. A PowerPoint presentation about why I needed to go. She had calculated everything down to the penny. My school supplies, my food costs broken down by meal, my clothes with price tags she'd apparently been tracking, even estimated expenses for high school activities I might want to join. She had charts showing how much money the family could save if they didn't have to support me. She called me a financial cancer eating away at the family resources. The whole time, my dad just sat there nodding along like she was presenting a quarterly business report instead of talking about throwing away his own son. When she got to the slide titled Investment Opportunities for James and Gideon's Future, he actually leaned forward with interest. She told me the money being wasted on me could be better spent on James and Gideon's college funds, their sports equipment, their future. She said I was holding back two bright boys from reaching their potential. The twins thought this whole thing was hilarious and kept making comments about how they always knew I was just dead weight. Then came the part that still wakes me up sometimes. Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out a Greyhound bus ticket to downtown. She'd already bought it. She told me there was a youth shelter about 6 blocks from the bus station that took in kids like me. Strays, she called us. She said they had programs to help homeless children, and that I'd probably be happier there with other kids who understood what it was like to not have a real family. I looked at my dad, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he pulled out a manila folder and showed me papers he'd already signed. Termination of parental rights. He said he'd talked to a lawyer and that at his age, starting over with a new family, it just made more sense for everyone involved. I begged him to reconsider. I promised I'd eat less, take up less space, cause no problems. I told him I'd get a job as soon as I was old enough. I said I'd pay him back for everything he'd spent on me. James and Gideon started chanting about how I was going to be homeless now, how I'd probably end up begging for money on street corners. My dad told me I was being dramatic, and that this was actually a good opportunity for me to learn independence. Vanessa said she was doing me a favor because I'd never learned to stand on my own 2 feet if I kept depending on them. They gave me 30 minutes to pack. Vanessa handed me 3 garbage bags and told me to only take what I absolutely needed because I'd have to carry everything myself. I packed my clothes, a few books, and the only photo I had of my mom. Everything else I'd ever owned. Every toy, every school project, every memory from the first 11 years of my life stayed in that house. When I was done packing, Vanessa walked me to the front door. She handed me $40 for food and told me never to come back. She said if I ever tried to contact them again, she'd call the police and tell them I was harassing her family. The last thing I heard before the door closed was James telling Gideon that now they could turn my room into a gaming room. I was 11 years old, carrying everything I owned in garbage bags, standing at a bus stop at 9 o'clock at night. The shelter was rougher than anything I could have imagined. Kids aging out of the system, runaways, kids whose parents were in jail or rehab. I learned quickly how to keep my head down and my mouth shut. The foster system was a rotating door of families who either wanted the monthly check or were genuinely trying to help but didn't have the resources for a traumatized kid. But here's the thing about being thrown away when you're 11. It teaches you that you can only count on yourself. I worked harder in school than any kid should have to. I got every scholarship, every grant, every work-study job I could find. Community college while working nights at a warehouse. State school on a full ride. Law school with loans I'm still paying off, but I made it. I built a career in corporate law. I'm not rich, but I make good money. I own my condo outright. I've got savings, investments, a retirement plan. I never married, never had kids, but I've got a life I built entirely on my own terms. Here's what I never told anyone, though. I never forgot what they did to me. Not for a single day. Every success I had, every promotion, every dollar I saved, part of me was thinking about the day they might need something from me. Call it petty. But I always wondered what would happen if the tables turned. I kept tabs on them over the years. Social media made it easy. Douglas retired early and they moved to a bigger house. James and Gideon both went to expensive private colleges. Vanessa posted constantly about family vacations, new cars, home renovations. They looked happy. They looked like they'd never given a second thought to the kid they'd thrown away. Yesterday changed everything. My phone started buzzing around noon with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them at first, but then the text started coming in. The first one was from Douglas, and I recognized his number because I'd never deleted it from my contacts. Some part of me always wondered if he'd ever try to reach out. The text said he'd been trying to call me for weeks and that it was urgent. Then came another one from Vanessa's number. Then numbers I didn't recognize but figured were probably James and Gideon. The messages kept coming all afternoon, each one more desperate than the last. Something about losing their house, debts piling up, eviction notices. They kept saying they needed to talk to me urgently, that I was the only one who could help them now. The text that really got to me was from Vanessa. She said she'd always considered me part of the family and hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive old misunderstandings. She said they were facing a crisis and needed someone they could trust to help them figure out their options. Old misunderstandings? That's what she called throwing an 11-year-old kid out with garbage bags and a bus ticket. Douglas sent the longest message around dinner time. He said he knew we'd had our differences when I was younger, but that family was family, and he hoped I'd grown up enough to understand that everyone makes mistakes. He said they were desperate and didn't know who else to turn to. James texted me asking if I remembered him and saying they really needed my help with something legal. Gideon's message was shorter, but basically the same thing. Both of them acting like we were old friends catching up, instead of the kids who laughed while their mother threw me away. I haven't responded to any of them yet. Part of me wants to know exactly what happened to them that's made them so desperate they'd reach out to the kid they discarded 15 years ago. Another part of me thinks they made their choice back then, and now they can live with the consequences. But honestly, after spending half my life wondering what I'd say if this moment ever came, now that it's here, I'm not sure what to do. They threw me away when I needed them most. They never once checked to see if I was okay, if I'd survived, if I'd made something of myself. Now they need me and expect me to just forget everything that happened. The thing is, I haven't forgotten. I remember every single detail of that night. I remember the PowerPoint slides. I remember the garbage bags. I remember standing at that bus stop wondering if anyone would ever love me enough to keep me. They destroyed an 11-year-old kid without a second thought. Now they want that same kid, all grown up, to save them from whatever mess they've gotten themselves into. What would you do? Update 1. Holy hell, Reddit. I wasn't prepared for what happened when I called Douglas yesterday. You guys said I should hear them out, and some of you were right that I needed closure. But man, this conversation revealed so much more than I expected. I called Douglas around 10 a.m., figuring I'd catch him before he had time to rehearse whatever sob story he'd planned. The phone rang twice before he picked up, and I could hear the desperation in his voice immediately. He started talking before I could even say hello, thanking me over and over for calling back, saying he knew I was a good man and that family always comes through for each other. Family. That word coming from him made me want to hang up right there. I cut him off and told him I wanted to know exactly what was going on. Why were they contacting me after 15 years of silence? What kind of trouble were they in that made them think reaching out to the kid they threw away was their best option? That's when the whole story started tumbling out. Douglas has always been a talker when he's nervous, and apparently 15 years hadn't changed that. He started explaining how things had been rough for them lately, how the economy affected everyone, how unexpected expenses had piled up. I let him ramble for a few minutes before I interrupted and asked him to be specific. Turns out their perfect little family had some major cracks. James, their golden boy, had gotten into some serious financial trouble. After college, he'd started a business with money Douglas had co-signed for. The business failed spectacularly, leaving them on the hook for over $200,000 in loans. But that wasn't even the worst part. Douglas told me James had been struggling with gambling for years. He'd hidden it well at first, but after the business failed, he'd gotten desperate trying to win back what he'd lost. He'd been using credit cards in Douglas and Vanessa's names, taking cash advances, even borrowing against their house without telling them. By the time they found out, James had racked up another $150,000 in debt. The banks were calling in the loans, and they were facing foreclosure on the house they'd bought after I left. the same house they'd been so proud of on social media. I asked about Gideon, and that's when Douglas got really quiet. Gideon had cut contact with the family 2 years ago, after some kind of major fight. Douglas wouldn't give me details, but he kept saying Gideon had always been the difficult one, always causing problems, never appreciating everything they'd done for him. Sound familiar? Apparently, when one golden child screws up, you need another scapegoat. But here's what really got to me. I asked Douglas why they thought I would help them after what they'd done to me. I wanted to hear him acknowledge what happened that night 15 years ago. I wanted some kind of accountability. Instead, Douglas started talking about how I'd been such an angry, difficult child, how I'd never adjusted well to the new family dynamic, how Vanessa had tried so hard to include me, but I'd always been resistant to her efforts. He said they'd made the decision they thought was best for everyone involved, including me. He actually said that sending me away had probably been good for me in the long run because it taught me independence and resilience. He said, look how well I'd turned out, how successful I'd become. He tried to frame throwing me out as some kind of tough love that had made me stronger. I lost it. I told him that wasn't what happened, and he knew it. I reminded him about the PowerPoint presentation, about Vanessa calling me a financial cancer, about them laughing while they packed my stuff in garbage bags. I told him about the shelter, about the foster homes, about working 3 jobs to put myself through college. Douglas got defensive and said I was remembering things wrong, that my anger was clouding my memory of what really happened. He said Vanessa had put together a presentation about family finances, but it wasn't about getting rid of me. It was about helping me understand why I might be happier in a more suitable environment. More suitable environment. That's how he described throwing an 11-year-old into the foster system. When I pressed him on the details, he started backtracking. He said maybe Vanessa had been a little harsh in how she'd explained things, but that she'd been under a lot of stress trying to blend the families. He said I'd been acting out and they'd thought a fresh start might help everyone. I asked him about the termination of parental rights, about the bus ticket, about the $40 and the threat to call the police if I ever came back. Suddenly, his memory got fuzzy about those details. He said things might have gotten more heated than they'd intended, but that I was exaggerating how bad it had been. That's when I realized Douglas genuinely believes his own revised version of history. 15 years of living with the consequences of his decision had turned him into someone who couldn't face what he'd actually done. He'd rewritten the story in his head until he was almost the victim. I decided to test something. I asked him what he thought I owed them after everything that had happened. Without hesitation, he started talking about family obligations and how successful people have a responsibility to help their relatives in times of need. He said I was probably the only person they could trust to help them figure out their legal options, maybe co-sign for a loan or help them negotiate with the banks. He wanted me to use my legal knowledge and my good credit to help them save the house that James had essentially stolen from them, the same house they'd bought with money they saved by getting rid of me. I asked him what Vanessa thought about reaching out to me. He said she'd been hesitant at first because she was worried I might still be holding grudges from when I was younger. But she'd agreed that family was family, and that I'd probably matured enough to understand that everyone makes mistakes when they're trying to do their best in difficult situations. Holding grudges from when I was younger, like I'd been some petulant teenager mad about a curfew instead of a child who'd been abandoned. I told Douglas I needed time to think about everything he'd told me. I said I'd call him back in a few days with my decision about whether I was willing to help them. The relief in his voice was obvious. He started thanking me again, saying he knew I'd come through for them, that he'd always been proud of how I'd turned out despite our rocky start. He said Vanessa would be so happy to hear I was considering helping them. After I hung up, I sat in my car for about an hour just processing what I'd heard. They're not just in financial trouble, their whole perfect family facade has completely collapsed. James, the golden boy they'd chosen over me, had destroyed them financially and then disappeared when the consequences caught up with him. Gideon had apparently seen through their dysfunction and cut contact entirely. And now they want the kid they threw away to save them from the mess their chosen children had made. The thing is, I'm not that 11-year-old boy anymore. I'm not desperate for their approval or their love. I don't need them to acknowledge what they did or apologize for it. I know what happened, and that's enough. But I also know something they don't know yet. I've been successful, yes, but I've also been planning for this day for 15 years. Every career move I made, every connection I built, every dollar I saved, part of it was always about being ready for the moment when they might need something from me. I have options now that 11-year-old me never had. I have power they don't even realize I have, and I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with it. Some of you said I should just walk away and let them face the consequences of their choices. Others said I should help them because it's the right thing to do. A few of you suggested I should make them really understand what they put me through before I decide anything. I think I'm going to call Vanessa next. I want to hear her version of why they're reaching out to me. I want to know if she even remembers the PowerPoint presentation, or if she's rewritten history too. And then I'm going to make some phone calls to people I know in the banking industry. Because if I'm going to make a decision about their situation, I want to understand exactly how bad things really are for them. Thanks for all the support, Reddit. Your comments on my first post gave me the courage to make that phone call. I'll update again after I talk to Vanessa. This is far from over. Update 2. Reddit. I called Vanessa yesterday, and the conversation was even more infuriating than talking to Douglas. Some of you said she might have changed over the years, that maybe she'd gained some perspective on what they did to me. Others warned me she'd probably be the same manipulative person who threw out an 11-year-old kid. You were right to warn me. I called her around 2 p.m., figuring she'd be home and available to talk. She answered on the first ring, and her voice immediately took on this syrupy sweet tone that I remembered from when I was a kid. She started gushing about how wonderful it was to hear from me, how she'd thought about me over the years, how proud she was of everything I'd accomplished. Proud. Like she had anything to do with my success. I cut through the fake pleasantries and told her I'd spoken with Douglas about their situation. I said I wanted to hear her perspective on why they thought reaching out to me was appropriate given our history. That's when her tone shifted. She started talking about how I'd always been such a smart boy, how she'd always believed I had potential, despite the challenges we'd faced as a blended family. She said she'd hoped I'd grown up enough to understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions in complicated situations. I asked her specifically about the night they threw me out. I wanted to know if she remembered the PowerPoint presentation, the bus ticket, packing my clothes in garbage bags. Vanessa got quiet for a moment, then started explaining how that night had been taken out of context in my memory. She said she'd put together a financial presentation to help the family understand their budget constraints, and that my reaction to it had been more dramatic than the situation warranted. She actually said that what I remembered as them throwing me out was really me choosing to leave because I was upset about having to follow household rules and contribute to family responsibilities like James and Gideon did. I told her that was complete nonsense. I reminded her about calling me a financial cancer, about the termination of parental rights, about threatening to call the police if I ever came back. Vanessa sighed and said I was still holding on to anger from my childhood that was preventing me from seeing the situation clearly. She said she understood that losing my mother had been traumatic for me, and that I'd struggled to accept her as a parental figure. She painted herself as someone who'd tried her best with a difficult, grieving child who'd ultimately chosen to reject the family structure she'd worked so hard to create. Then she started talking about James and Gideon like they were still children instead of grown men in their 30s. She said James had always been sensitive and that his current problems were the result of him being too trusting and generous with business partners who'd taken advantage of him. She said he'd made some mistakes, but that's what family was for, to help each other through difficult times. I asked her where James was now, why he wasn't part of these conversations about fixing the financial mess he'd created. That's when Vanessa really showed her true colors. She said James was going through a difficult period and needed space to work through his personal issues. She said he was staying with friends while he figured out his next steps, and that she and Douglas were handling the financial situation to protect him from additional stress. James had abandoned them, just like they'd abandoned me. But somehow he was still the victim who needed protection. I asked about Gideon and why he wasn't helping with their crisis. Vanessa's voice got cold, and she said Gideon had always been ungrateful and had cut contact with the family over petty disagreements. She said he'd never appreciated the sacrifices she and Douglas had made for him and his brother. Sacrifices. Like what they'd done for James and Gideon was somehow noble, while what they'd done to me was justified. I decided to test something. I asked Vanessa what she thought would be fair for me to do in this situation. What kind of help did she think I owed them? Without hesitation, she started outlining a plan. She wanted me to co-sign for a loan to help them keep the house. She thought I could use my legal connections to negotiate with the banks for better terms on James's debts. She even suggested I might consider letting James stay with me for a while until he got back on his feet. She wanted me to save James the same way no one had saved me. Then she said something that made my blood boil. She told me this was my chance to really become part of the family in a way I'd never been able to when I was younger. She said helping them through this crisis would prove that I'd matured beyond the resentment and selfishness that had caused problems when I was a child. Selfishness. She called an 11-year-old's need for basic shelter and security selfish. I asked her what she thought I owed them after they'd abandoned me as a child. Vanessa got defensive and said they'd never abandoned me. She said they'd made the difficult decision to find me a living situation that was better suited to my needs, and that it had obviously worked out well since I'd become so successful. She actually tried to take credit for my success. She said their tough decision had forced me to become independent and resilient, and that I should be grateful for the character-building experience they'd given me. Character build. That's what she called homelessness and trauma. I told Vanessa I needed to think about their request and that I'd be in touch. Before I hung up, I asked her one more question. I wanted to know if she'd ever wondered what happened to me after that night, if she'd ever worried about whether I was okay. She got quiet again, then said she'd always trusted that I was resourceful enough to land on my feet. She said she'd occasionally seen my name in legal publications over the years and had been pleased to see I'd done well for myself. She'd been tracking my career success while never once considering reaching out to repair the relationship she'd destroyed. After I hung up, I made some calls to contacts I have in banking and finance. I wanted to understand exactly how deep their financial hole really was. What I learned was interesting. Their situation is bad, but it's not hopeless. The house is worth more than they owe on it, even with James's additional loans. They could sell it, pay off the debts, and still have enough left over to buy a smaller place outright. They'd have to downsize significantly, and Douglas would probably need to come out of retirement, but they wouldn't be homeless. The problem is they don't want to give up the lifestyle they've built. They want to keep the big house, maintain their standard of living, and have someone else clean up James's mess. They want me to sacrifice my financial security to preserve theirs, just like they'd sacrificed me to preserve their perfect family image 15 years ago. I also did some digging into James's situation. He's not staying with friends working through personal issues. He's been living with a girlfriend in another state for the past 6 months. He's got a job at a software company making decent money, but he's chosen to let his parents deal with the debt he created, rather than take responsibility for it himself. He threw them away the same way they threw me away, except they're still making excuses for him. I've been thinking about what I want to do with all this information. Some of you said I should help them because it's the right thing to do. Others said I should walk away and let them figure it out themselves. A few suggested I should make them really understand what they put me through before making any decisions. But here's what I've realized. They're never going to understand what they did to me. They've spent 15 years rewriting history to make themselves the victims of a difficult situation, rather than the adults who chose to abandon a child. They're not capable of genuine accountability. The question isn't whether they deserve my help. The question is what kind of person I want to be. I think I know what I'm going to do, but I want to talk to one more person first. I'm going to track down Gideon and hear his side of why he cut contact with the family. If he went through something similar to what I experienced, that's going to influence my decision. Thanks for all the support and advice, Reddit. Your comments have helped me see this situation more clearly. One more update coming after I talk to Gideon. This family drama is about to get a lot more complicated. Final update. Reddit. It's over. I found Gideon, had the conversation that changed everything, and made my final decision about Douglas and Vanessa. Thank you all for the support and advice throughout this whole mess. Finding Gideon took some work, but I tracked him down through professional networks. He's a software engineer living about 3 states away, married with 2 young kids. When I called him and explained who I was, there was this long silence before he said he'd been wondering if I'd ever surface again. We talked for over 2 hours, and what he told me filled in all the missing pieces. Gideon confirmed everything I suspected about the family dynamics. He said after I left, he and James became the new targets when anything went wrong. Vanessa had this way of pitting them against each other, always comparing them, always making one the favorite and one the scapegoat, depending on what served her purposes. He told me that James had always been Vanessa's clear favorite, but that came with its own price. She was controlling and manipulative with him, convinced him he couldn't succeed without her guidance, made him financially dependent even as an adult. When James started the business that failed, it was with money Vanessa had pressured Douglas to invest. Gideon said he'd tried to warn James about their mother's manipulation, but James couldn't see it. He was too invested in being the golden child. When Gideon started setting boundaries with Vanessa and refusing to play her games, she turned the whole family against him. The final break came when Gideon got engaged. Vanessa didn't approve of his fiancé and tried to sabotage the relationship. When that didn't work, she told Douglas that Gideon was being disrespectful and ungrateful, that he needed to choose between his family and his girlfriend. Gideon chose his girlfriend. He said it was the best decision he ever made. He also told me something that made everything click into place. Vanessa had always been jealous of my relationship with Douglas. Even though Douglas was weak and ultimately chose her over me, there had been a period right after my mom died when he and I were really close. Vanessa saw that bond as a threat to her control over the family. Getting rid of me wasn't just about money. It was about eliminating competition for Douglas's attention and loyalty. Gideon said he'd thought about reaching out to me over the years, but He'd assumed I wouldn't want anything to do with anyone connected to that family. He said he was glad I'd called and hoped we could stay in touch going forward. After talking to Gideon, I knew what I had to do. I called Douglas and told him I'd made my decision. I said I'd help them with their situation, but only on my terms. I told him I wanted all four of them on a video call. Him, Vanessa, James, and Gideon, so we could discuss this as a family. Douglas started making excuses about why that wasn't possible. James was dealing with personal issues. Gideon wouldn't participate. It would be too complicated to coordinate. I told him that was fine. If they couldn't all commit to an honest conversation about the family dynamics, then I couldn't commit to helping them. I said they could either have the call or figure out their financial problems on their own. Douglas agreed to set it up. The video call happened yesterday evening. Seeing all of them together for the first time in 15 years was surreal. Douglas looked older and tired. Vanessa had the same fake smile but more lines around her eyes. James looked uncomfortable and kept avoiding eye contact. Gideon looked confident and calm. I started by explaining that I'd been successful in my career and life, not because of the tough love they'd given me, but despite the abandonment and trauma they'd caused. I told them I'd built a good life entirely on my own, with no help from the family that was supposed to protect me. Then I laid out exactly what I knew about their financial situation. I'd done my homework. I knew about the business loans, the gambling debts, the credit cards, the mortgage situation. I knew James was living comfortably in another state while letting his parents handle his mess. I knew they could solve their problems by downsizing and James taking responsibility for his debts. Vanessa tried to interrupt and make excuses, but I kept talking. I told them I was willing to help them, but not in the way they wanted. I wasn't going to co-sign loans or give them money to maintain their current lifestyle. Instead, I was offering to help them find a lawyer to negotiate payment plans with creditors, connect them with a financial planner to help them downsize responsibly, and provide resources for James to get help with his gambling problem. Real help, not enablement. James immediately got defensive and said he didn't have a gambling problem, that his business had failed due to market conditions, that everyone was being unfair to him. He said he was working and doing his best to rebuild his life. I told James that his best wasn't good enough if it involved letting his parents lose their home while he lived comfortably elsewhere. I said if he wanted my help, he needed to move back home, get a second job if necessary, and commit to paying back every dollar he'd cost his parents. James said that was unrealistic and unfair. He said he had his own life to worry about and couldn't be expected to sacrifice his future for mistakes that were in the past. Vanessa jumped in to defend James, saying he was struggling and needed support, not judgment. She said I was being harsh and unreasonable, that family was supposed to help each other without conditions. That's when I lost it. I told Vanessa that she had no right to lecture anyone about family support. I reminded her about the PowerPoint presentation, about calling me a financial cancer, about throwing me out with garbage bags. I told her that everything she was asking me to do for James was exactly what she'd refused to do for me when I was a child. I said if family was supposed to help each other without conditions, where was my help when I was 11 years old and homeless? Where was my unconditional support when I was working 3 jobs to put myself through college? Vanessa tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I told them that James was 30 years old and had made his own choices. I had been 11 years old and had no choices at all. If they expected me to save James from the consequences of his decisions, they should have saved me from the consequences of theirs. Douglas finally spoke up and said I was right. He said he'd made terrible decisions as a father and that he was sorry for what they'd put me through. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive them, but he hoped I could find it in my heart to help them anyway. Too little, too late. I told them my offer stood: professional help to manage their debt, resources for James to address his problems, and assistance finding a sustainable living situation. But no money, no co-signing, and no enabling James to avoid responsibility. James said that wasn't real help. That was just judgment disguised as assistance. He said if I really cared about family, I'd understand that they needed financial support, not lectures. I told James he was right about one thing. I didn't really care about family, not this family. They'd made it clear 15 years ago that I wasn't part of it, and nothing had changed since then. I said they had a choice. They could accept my offer of practical help and start taking responsibility for their situation, or they could figure it out on their own like they'd expected me to do when I was a child. Vanessa started crying and saying I was being cruel, that they were desperate and needed my help. She said she'd always loved me like a son and couldn't understand why I was being so cold. I told Vanessa that if she'd loved me like a son, she wouldn't have thrown me away like garbage. I said her tears didn't change the fact that she'd destroyed a child's life without a second thought. I gave them 48 hours to decide whether they wanted my help on my terms or preferred to handle their problems without me. They chose to handle it without me. Douglas called me this morning to say they'd decided to decline my offer. He said they'd find another way to work through their financial problems. He thanked me for my time and said he hoped I'd have a good life. I told him I already did. So that's it, Reddit. They're on their own, just like they left me on my own 15 years ago. I offered them exactly what they gave me, the opportunity to figure it out themselves and become stronger people in the process. Some of you might think I was too harsh, that I should have just helped them financially and moved on. But here's the thing. Enabling their dysfunction wouldn't have been help. It would have been rewarding the same entitled thinking that let them throw away a child when he became inconvenient. James will probably continue avoiding responsibility while his parents lose their house. Vanessa will keep making excuses and playing victim. Douglas will keep going along with whatever Vanessa wants because it's easier than standing up to her. But that's not my problem anymore. I'm done carrying the weight of their poor choices. I'm done wondering what I owe them or what they might learn from this situation. I'm done with all of it. Gideon and I are planning to meet up next month when I'm in his area for work. We're going to start building the kind of family relationship that should have existed all along, one based on mutual respect and genuine care. For those of you who followed this whole mess from the beginning, thank you for helping me see the situation clearly. Your comments gave me the courage to stand up for myself and set boundaries I should have set years ago. To anyone dealing with toxic family members who come crawling back when they need something, you don't owe them anything. You don't have to forgive them, help them, or give them another chance to hurt you. You get to choose who deserves space in your life. I chose myself. And for the first time in 15 years, that feels like enough. Thanks for everything, Reddit. This chapter is finally closed.